With little more than the stroke of the president's pen or through an act of Congress, the U.S. government can use financial sanctions to impose enormous economic costs on targeted foreign actors, be they individuals, firms, or state institutions, by freezing their dollar assets or cutting them off from access to the banks through which those dollars flow. The consequences for individual targets, known as specially designated nationals or SDNs, are severe, significantly impairing a target's capacity to participate in international trade, investment, debt repayment, and depriving them of access to their wealth. Over the last 2 decades, the United States has used the tool of financial sanctions with increasing frequency. For example, in the year 2000, just 4 foreign governments were directly targeted under a U.S. Treasury country program overseen by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. Today, that number is greater than 20, and if we include penalties from secondary sanctions, the list gets even longer. The more that the United States has reached for financial sanctions, the more it has made adversaries in foreign capitals aware of the strategic vulnerability that stems from dependence on the dollar. Some governments have responded by implementing anti-dollar policies, measures that are designed to reduce an economy's reliance on the U.S. currency for investment in cross-border transactions. Though these measures sometimes fail to achieve their goals, others have produced modest levels of de-dollarization. Notable examples here include Russian steps to cut its dollar reserves and reduce the use of the dollar in trade settlement in the years leading up to its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, or China's ongoing efforts to build its own international payments network based on the yuan, efforts that have taken on a new sense of urgency as Beijing has become more aware of its own strategic vulnerabilities from dollar dependence.
So the abuse of sanctions powers is leading other countries to try to limit their exposure to the dollar and therefore U.S. power. And instead of pulling back, United States elites are openly discussing escalating the abuse of sanctions power to an unprecedented extent.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, friend, and thank you for listening to the 276th episode of the listener-supported, ad-free, every source documented in the show notes Congressional Dish, which is a podcast about what Congress is doing with your money and in your name. And I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. Today's episode is an examination of what Congress is being told about our country's role in the world. And for this episode, I watched 2 absolutely fascinating hearings about the World Trade System, which is the nickname I use to describe the global financial system whose main institutions are the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. And most of the time when the global financial system is discussed, at least here in the United States, it tends to be discussed in terms of isms, capitalism, neoliberalism. And these are terms that are thrown around as if anyone really understands what they mean. But there are actual institutions with written down laws created by trade agreements and that have governing processes governing the world. These are institutions that can be named, that can be understood, and that can be changed. And so that's why I don't use the ism terms in these episodes, because I don't see how it's useful to discuss economic theories from textbooks when there are real world organizations run by human beings that we could examine and possibly alter. Because since the end of World War II, our country has been at the forefront of creating an economic system that was intended to be the one financial system to rule the world. And most countries in the world are, in fact, members of it. But for a lot of reasons that have been examined in episodes past and will be expanded upon in this episode, that system's dominance in the world is being threatened by the creation of, a new global financial system designed specifically to reduce the power of the United States over the world. In this episode, you're going to hear the most fascinating portions of 2 hearings in Congress that were informing our lawmakers about the current status of the World Trade System and the role of the United States currency as the world reserve currency, as in the currency used in the vast majority of international trades. And just so you know, there were some clips that were definitely interesting, but not central to the overall theme of this episode. And quite frankly, I couldn't figure out a way to shoehorn them in here. And so, if you are a financial supporter of Congressional Dish and therefore have access to my green room, which is most easily accessed by supporting the show on Patreon, I will have a bonus episode for you that will come out at the same time as this one that will have the rest of the clips. There were like 5 or 6 of them. And you can find the links to become a financial supporter of the show using the support page on congressionaldish.com. And congressionaldish.com is also where you can find the show notes for this episode, with timestamps for all of the sound clips in the hearings so that you can go into the hearings and listen to them in context. And I also give you links to all of the documents and articles that I use for research, because chances are you don't know me, and trust is earned. And of course, we are living in an age of vast bullshittery, and so the show notes are how I earn your trust and prove that I am not spewing the aforementioned bullshit. And you can also often find the show notes in the notes section in your podcast app. But if you are listening to Congressional Dish right now for the first time, there is an older episode of this podcast that you might want to listen to before you listen to this one, just to get caught up on this whole world trade system thing. Because even though we are the most powerful country in the system, to an extent that I didn't quite realize until this very episode, but despite that being the indisputable fact, American citizens are oddly kept in the dark about the World Trade System's existence and our role in it. We get very little news about what happens in the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, or any of the other little tiny banks that are a part of this system as well. In fact, I was about 100 episodes into this podcast before the existence and especially the importance of this global economic system landed on my own radar. And so don't be embarrassed if this is all pretty new to you, because it all still feels pretty new to me. But I've been learning about it out loud on air, and this episode is a continuation of that education. And so if you want to hear how I was first exposed to the existence of the system and learn the basics of how it was created and why, check out episode 102, which is named The World Trade Organization, which is an episode that I produced in 2015 when I saw a bill that did end up becoming law in the United States that repealed the requirement that some meat producers tell us where our food was coming from. And since I knew that there were no Americans at the time taking to the streets to demand that our food sources be hidden from us, I asked, why in the holy hell would Congress do this? Well, it turns out it was because of the World Trade Organization. We lost a case in the World Trade Organization's judicial system because we treated a Canadian company different than we treated our own, which was a realization that only led me to more what the type questions. And with that, the rabbit hole was open and I jumped in, and I still feel like I'm just at the beginning of it. Now, that episode 102, has 3 executive producers on it, which makes it tied for the number 2 spot in the most valuable episodes list of Congressional Dish episodes. And so we put a link to it in this episode show notes for you, and you can also find it on the most valuable episodes list. But also in this episode's show notes, we're going to list a few more episodes that I'll reference for you along the way. Like I said, this episode is building on a lot of education that I've done in the past. But episode 102, if you listen to one episode before this one, make that the one, because that should catch you up enough to follow this episode with no problems. Oakley dokley. So now that you're back from listening to episode 102, and you're all caught up on the fact that the World Bank is the bank part of that system, the World Trade Organization houses the judicial system, and the International Monetary Fund is the loan shark, well, let's get into the hearings, which focused mostly on the International Monetary Fund and its lending programs. The hearing that a lot of these clips are going to come from took place in the House Financial Services Committee on May 25th. And the witness you're going to hear from the most is Mark Rosen, who used to be the acting United States Executive Director of the International Monetary Fund. And this is why I love these hearings. I love getting to learn about how these organizations work from the people on the inside and at the top of them. And that certainly describes Mark Rosen. Mark Rosen has not only been on the inside and at the top of the International Monetary Fund, but he's also been on the inside and at the top of multinational banking corporations and our government. So before becoming the acting United States Executive Director for the IMF, he was Credit Suisse's head of Latin America financial institutions for over a decade, moving on to then become the chairman of Latin America investment banking at Bank of America. He left that gig as a titan of multinational banking to become President Trump's Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Financial Markets at the United States Treasury Department for a few months, which is the job he left to go be one of the heads of the IMF. And since leaving the IMF, he created a company that specializes in buying and merging businesses in Latin America, and he's now a partner at Advection Growth Capital, which helps rich investors make money around the world. And of course, Mark Rosen is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is one of, if not the creepy organization of elites, which has been dedicated to the cause of making the world safe and profitable for multinational corporations since its founding in 1921. There is a constantly revolving door between the Council on Foreign Relations and U.S. government leaders. What is said in the Council on Foreign Relations often ends up in U.S. policy. And just so you get an idea of what kind of heavy hitters are in the Council on Foreign Relations, current members of the Council on Foreign Relations include Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Always pay attention to the Council on Foreign Relations. And so here's Mark Rosen testifying to Congress last month about the International Monetary Fund.
The IMF is the global lender of last resort to countries that are in economic distress. IMF borrowers usually have a balance of payments problem, are running out of foreign exchange reserves, and so cannot meet their obligations. The IMF negotiates a set of economic policies with the borrowing government to alleviate the crisis, and conditional on the government implementing the agreed policies, provides a loan in tranches, normally over a 3-year period.
And this is why I call the IMF a loan shark, because IMF loans always come with strings. Reading now from the IMF website, quote, typically, a country's government and the IMF agree upon a program of economic policies before the IMF lends to the country. In most cases, a country's commitments to undertake certain policy actions, known as policy conditionality, are an integral part of IMF lending, unquote. And giving a not too subtle hint as to what kind of changes to a government's economic policies are demanded by the IMF in return for their cash, and the purpose of those demands, the website says, quote, because IMF lending usually is accompanied by a set of corrective policy actions, it signals that appropriate policies are being put in place, encouraging the return of private investors, unquote. Over and over and over again. Every time I've jumped down the IMF rabbit hole, I find the IMF demanding policies be implemented that allow multinational corporations to operate in the target country and allow those multinationals to legally remove money, as in profits, from that country, with the companies being required to pay as little in taxes to that government as possible. Free trade. And I've discovered that a great place to look at what specific policies are being demanded of these countries in return for the IMF loans are letters of intent, which are basically lists of promises made by the countries to the IMF Executive Board, and which are publicly available on the IMF's website. And so, poking around on their website for this episode, I discovered that as of this recording, the country that is the most indebted to the IMF by far right now, and would therefore be in the middle of a program to change their laws in order to please foreign private investors, aka multinational corporations, is Argentina, followed by Egypt, Ukraine, Ecuador, and Pakistan. But since Argentina is the most indebted to the IMF, let's just take a look at what Argentina is being told to do. Now, one thing that I found interesting is that Argentina is in the middle of enacting debt reduction measures, which are being required by the IMF, which are considered heretical to one of the USA's top two political parties, the Republicans, such as an increase on export taxes on crap that multinationals sell overseas and a wealth tax. So even the IMF thinks that raising taxes is sometimes required to tackle debt. But in Argentina, they are also promising the IMF that they will implement a hiring freeze on public employees, that they will reduce subsidies on energy, which make fossil fuel expenses affordable for the citizens. They're promising to reduce government services, and they're promising to create more, quote, public-private partnerships, unquote, to replace those government services. Argentina is also promising to, quote, cut red tape for making Argentina an attractive destination for local and international businesses alike, unquote. And they also promise to continue with their, quote, anti-corruption efforts, unquote, and, quote, strengthening prosecutorial and judicial proceedings, unquote. And I see promises like this in just about every IMF document I read. And they are always so broad. I can never find specifics. And so even now, I don't know exactly what they mean when they talk about anti-corruption measures, but Mark Rosen provided some clues when he was talking to Congress.
Two other issues I'd like to focus on are anti-corruption and the catalytic role of the private sector in the work of the IMF. Corruption is a severe problem for many emerging market countries which do not have strong institutions that can confront and root out corruption. The IMF is certainly doing a much better job than it did historically on anti-corruption, but I believe it's critical that it continues to make anti-corruption laws and policies front and centre in the conditions of its lending programmes, as well as a focus of its technical assistance. Only by reducing corruption will many of these countries be able to attract the vast amount of private sector investment which is potentially available and remains the ultimate key to reducing poverty. Establishing a rule of law, including laws to protect private property, is key to unlocking this investment, and it should be a focus of the IMF and World Bank to encourage these countries to improve the rule of law and to fight corruption. If they do that, emerging market countries can attract private capital and grow rapidly, as many countries that have followed that path have already done so successfully.
It's kind of fascinating that the IMF, as we can see in writing in Argentina's documents, requires citizens of target countries to pay more out of pocket for essentials like energy and eliminates government services that are provided in return for taxes, and instead has those services performed in partnerships with private companies, adding in the cost of profit. And then the IMF executives come to Congress and talk about multinational corporations entering a country as a way to reduce poverty? Because, speaking as a peasant, when does requiring citizens to pay more out of pocket and taking away tax-provided services and instead requiring us citizens to pay market rates with a profit margin built in, since when does that reduce poverty? And why is it that our representatives in Congress never ask these questions? Because going back to our example of Argentina first started implementing IMF reforms in the beginning of 1999. It's been over 2 decades of making the IMF's forced changes to their economic laws. And guess what? Poverty isn't solved yet. And as I speak, Argentina is the country most indebted to the IMF. Which makes you wonder if reducing poverty is an actual goal. And as I watch these things, it's impossible for me to tell. I mean, obviously, I don't know these people. And I can't tell if international banker guys like Mark Rosen actually believe what they're saying, or if they're just so corporate and just don't care, as long as the markets get opened for the corporations that they have spent a lifetime serving. Because listening to him talk about corruption in Congress, speaking about corruption to this Congress, which jerry-rigs its districts and has a bribery system for its own campaigns. I mean, if that's not corruption, what exactly is corruption to these people? And so to listen to this IMF insider's definition of corruption, it's still unclear to me. I don't know what they're talking about. But what does seem crystal clear, based on his testimony and all of my reading, is that whatever the anti-corruption measures are, they're intended to, as he said, protect private property, as in give multinational corporations ownership rights that they can trust in the target country. And this is a pattern that I have consistently witnessed in IMF documents. And so going back to Argentina, when they first made a deal with the IMF in 1999, the strings included requirements that Argentina privatize their national mortgage bank and that Argentina sells off its share of the country's oil company. Then the management of Argentina's airports, nuclear, and hydroelectric power plants were all turned over to the private sector to manage for a profit. And the IMF also got changes to Argentina's laws that made it cheaper for companies to fire Argentinian workers. And then more recently, we saw in Ecuador, which is a country I just produced a whole episode about. It's in the show notes for you. But Ecuador, which is now controlled by an administration totally on board with all of this stuff, well, Ecuador is being required to privatize their government bank and their public electricity companies as strings on previous IMF loans. And while Americans seem largely unaware of the IMF and its role in the world, and our role in it, I've happened upon protests in other countries against the IMF. There were big protests during the W. Bush years because of the IMF demands in Greece. In other parts of the world, the IMF is a boogeyman, and the media reports on the IMF regularly and negatively. There are places on this earth where the IMF is widely hated because of the strings that make life more expensive for citizens in the pursuit of creating opportunities for multinational corporations, who are always referred to as investors. And I just find it disturbing how little we hear about any of this in the United States. Disturbing, but really not surprising. Because the financial elites who have captured our government, they get international power via the IMF.
The United States is the largest shareholder in the IMF and has veto power over certain key decisions. And it's critical that the US continues to maintain its ownership at more than 15%, which enables it to have this veto power.
And it turns out that the power the US elites hold over the World Trade System institutions, that level of power, it's not just in the IMF. There are a whole web of banks in the business of opening countries to multinational businesses, and oh boy. So, the clip I have coming up for you next is of a guy named Daniel Rund, and he is another member of the Council on Foreign Relations who testified to the House last month. This guy is a former assistant vice president at Citibank. He then served in the government as George W. Bush's director of global development alliances at the U.S. Agency for International Development for almost 5 years. He then moved out of our government and into the global government as the head of partnerships at the International Finance Corporation, which is a part of the World Bank, and whose motto is, quote, creating markets, creating opportunities, unquote, and which describes its mission as, quote, encouraging the growth of private enterprise in developing countries, unquote. And now he is a senior vice president at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is a think tank who sends its members to testify to Congress all the time, especially about matters of war. And here's his testimony about the smaller banks within the World Trade System.
Multilateral development banks, MDBs, under U.S. and Western leadership are one way that we can respond with something. The United States built and strengthened the MDB system. MDBs provide money, advice, data, and convening power to help developing countries solve problems. If the U.S. exerts its influence over these institutions, they are force multipliers of a U.S.-led global system. If we disregard our leadership role, then other actors, including China, can exert influence over them. The World Bank Group is a series of institutions. It lends money to national governments. It has a private sector arm. It has an insurance arm. There are a series of other regional development banks, including the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank. Taiwan is a member of the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, and the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development Bank, focused mainly on countries that used to be behind the Iron Curtain. The United States has been instrumental in creating the majority of these institutions and remains the largest or one of the largest shareholders of every aforementioned MDB. Since the founding of these institutions, the U.S. has used its shareholding power to shape the policies and activities of MDBs in indirect support of American foreign policy.
This is why the financial elites in this country, those that lead both of our corporate political parties, are devoted to the World Trade System. It's how they exert power on a global scale. And now clearly, I saw this in Congress. I was able to download this off the internet. It wasn't on C-SPAN, but I was able to get it off of YouTube. And so none of this is being hidden from us, but it's certainly not highlighted. And I'm annoyed and disturbed that I'm just now even beginning to understand how this system is designed to work. But like I said, there is a much broader awareness of this system in other countries, and some countries are, let's just say, unhappy with this global system, which gives the United States majority shares in so many of its institutions, along with veto power. And one of those countries is obviously China. China is a member of the World Trade Organization, and its entry was controversial when it was welcomed exactly 2 months after 9/11. But to understand the thinking at the time, here's a summary of recent history written by Kurt Campbell and Eli Ratner, who are now the White House Indo-Pacific Coordinator and Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs in the Biden administration. In 2018, in the Council on Foreign Relations paywalled magazine called Foreign Affairs, they wrote, quote, at the end of World War II, the United States built institutions and rules that helped structure global politics and regional dynamics in Asia. Widely accepted norms such as the freedom of commerce and navigation, the peaceful resolution of disputes, and international cooperation on global challenges superseded 19th century spheres of influence. As a leading beneficiary of this liberal international order, the thinking went, Beijing would have a considerable stake in the order's preservation and come to see its continuation as essential to China's own progress. U.S. policy aimed to encourage Beijing's involvement by welcoming China into leading institutions and working with it on global governance and regional security. As China joined multilateral institutions, U.S. policymakers hoped that it would learn to play by the rules and soon begin to contribute to their upkeep, unquote. But it didn't work out that way, did it? Because China didn't play by the rules that were dictated to it by the World Trade System. Rules written via trade agreements, many of them led by the U.S., and none of them, at least that I'm aware of, that were led by China. And China, right now, is not happy with the distribution of power and control within the World Trade System that it is a member of. Here's Mark Rosen, the former executive director at the IMF.
China, for some time, has been pressing for an increased quota share at the IMF. However, given its irresponsible lending and unwillingness to provide debt relief to developing countries, this is not the time to reward China with increased ownership at the fund.
But I don't think that's the real reason that the IMF is unwilling to even the power and control distribution within the IMF. This is.
The biggest challenge that the IMF faces today is China, which, as we've heard, has lent vast sums to emerging market and low-income countries in a non-transparent and irresponsible manner. Many IMF members are now struggling to repay China.
Just like many IMF members are now struggling to repay the IMF. But the real problem there is that China is competition to the IMF. I've said many times that China took the IMF playbook once it was welcomed onto Team World Trade, copied it, and is now ripping it off. But that's not exactly true. Because the IMF lends cash to struggling countries in return for changes to their economic laws that help multinational corporations to profit within those countries. But China's overall strategy in lending is based on loaning other countries money to build things as part of their program known as the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. And as far as I can tell, the fundamental difference is that China does seem to stay out of the government decisions of the countries that they lend to. China doesn't seem to give a single fuck about how other countries structure their economies or whether or not they're democracies or autocracies or whatever, as long as Chinese companies get a cut of the profits or management contracts or even partial ownership of the new port or rail system or whatever they are loaning this country the money to build. And Daniel Rund, you'll remember him as the banker turned George W. Bush administration development dude turned think tanker. Well, he seemed to acknowledge that other countries are responding positively to the Chinese lending option.
Infrastructure is now a strategic issue. China's Belt and Road Initiative is a combination of construction and financing projects for roads, airports, and energy around the world. Unfortunately for us, BRI is an ambitious project that speaks to the hopes of China's friends and potential friends. To counter the BRI, the U.S. needs a positive alternative that says more than, don't work with China, right? That's not a strategy. We've got to have an alternative.
But then he also recommended that in one respect, don't work with China does need to happen.
China continues to borrow from the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. That is crazy. That needs to stop. China, as a shareholder, also has Chinese firms can bid on MDB projects. China wins a lot of, in terms of dollar value, a lot of the dollar value of World Bank contracts. Something to take a look at.
Which does seem a little odd, doesn't it? That China is competing with the World Trade System banks by basically also operating as a competing bank. And yet it's also still taking out World Trade System loans too. And the reason that seems strange is because the World Bank is only supposed to lend to corporations in developing countries. And it's really tough to perform the mental gymnastics needed to portray a country, as in China, that is lending money for huge infrastructure projects all over the world as a developing country. Pretty sure they're developed at this point. And people in this Congress do seem poised to take action on this front. And so here's a conversation between Daniel Rund and Representative Zach Nunn, who is a Republican from Iowa.
The business model of the World Bank is they lend money to richer countries with a pretty good credit rating, and then they cross-subsidize that by lending to poorer countries with a poorer credit rating. My view is China can finance its own development. We should stop this practice and I think the Asian Development Bank has sort of gotten the memo, but the World Bank has not fully gotten the memo. And they'll give you kind of World Banky answers to this sort of thing. We've got to stop it.
Mr. Wright, could not agree with you more. And you highlighted earlier, by 2025, China should graduate from this program. I'd offer that 2025 is 2 years too late. We can start funneling them off that now.
I agree, sir.
I think you're in the right spot. Thank you.
And Representative Andy Barr, who's a Republican of Kentucky, picked up the baton on this conversation and ran with it.
How do we end China's eligibility to borrow from the World Bank?
So the Asian Development Bank has said they're going to end their eligibility by 2025. We should absolutely hold them to that. There is a temptation for the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank to continue to loan for a couple of reasons. One is they say, well, this is a window into how we can understand China better. There's lots of other ways to understand China better. And or this is a way for us for a bunch of lending reasons that they do it. You all have the power of the purse. You have an ability. You should have blunted conversations with the administration about this. I suspect it's an open door, but it's going to require, I think, some pushing from Congress. I would encourage this committee to push the administration on ending lending to China.
And I noted that both of these members of Congress in these conversations were Republicans, because how do members of Congress push administrations headed by the other party to do anything? Via dingleberry. And we have a big spending fight brewing for this fall. And so what I mean by that is that members of Congress often attach things to must-sign pieces of legislation in order to get them into law, even if the administration doesn't want them to become law. And this happens all the time on government funding laws. And that is because if those don't get signed into law, we have a government shutdown, and it's a whole shit show. And right now, out of the 12 government funding laws that are supposed to be done by the end of September, not a single one has even passed the House. And so we are absolutely getting set up once again for one of these scenarios where these bills get crammed into one massive, massive bill that gets signed in an emergency situation, and that is ripe with dingleberry opportunities. And as I record this, Secretary of State Blinken is in China right now trying to convince the Chinese that we are not their enemies. But Congress, as you are hearing, is discussing using its power over the World Trade System to cut off China from money, instead of the World Trade System doing it without the United States Congress demanding it. And what I am concerned about is that this would be yet another needle poked into the Chinese eye. And so this is something to keep an eye out for as the last-minute 2,000-page government funding bill makes its way through Congress 10 seconds before Santa jumps down the chimneys this year. Okay. So that's the update on the congressional conversation about the IMF and World Trade System in general. But that actually wasn't the rabbit hole I was jumping down. The rabbit hole I was actually poking around in that led me to this topic was actually a follow-up on some questions I had after the last episode, the episode about the debt ceiling crisis, in regards to the status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Because in that episode, I told you that there are countries, big ones, led by China, that are taking important steps towards creating a separate international trading system which would not be based on trade in the US dollar. And it was suggested by members of Congress during the debt ceiling debates that threatening a breach of the debt ceiling and threatening to cause the inability of the US to pay some of our bills on time would hasten the demise of the dollar as the basis for global trade. But how advanced the de-dollarization process is, and how real those threats are, and how much we should even worry about this, I didn't know. And apparently I wasn't the only one with these questions bouncing around in my brain, because the House Financial Services Committee, which is the same one that had the hearing about the IMF in May, well, they then held a hearing on June 7th called Dollar Dominance, Preserving the US Dollar's Status as the Global Reserve Currency. Perfect! And so here's what I learned. So let's start off with the dollar's current status as the reserve currency. How often is the dollar used as the basis for international trade? Here's Dr. Tyler Goodspeed, who is not the guy who was welcomed to the Rock. No, this Goodspeed is far more boring than that Goodspeed. But he is no stranger to chaos, as this Goodspeed was a part of President Trump's Council on Economic Advisors for all 4 of those chaotic years. And since leaving the Trump administration, he has been the chief economist at Greenmantle, which is a company that helps multinational corporations in the energy, finance, and tech sectors make money around the world. And here's his testimony to Congress on June 7th about the current status of the dollar in international trade.
In 2022, as the ranking member highlighted, 88% of all foreign exchange transactions by value involve the United States dollar, a figure that has been roughly constant since 1989, which is testament to the substantial path dependence in international currency usage due to large positive network externalities. As the ranking member also highlighted, 59% of all official foreign exchange reserves were held in U.S. dollars, which is down from a figure of 71.5% in 2001. By comparison, 31% of all foreign exchange transactions by value involved the euro, which is the second most commonly transacted currency, which accounted for 20% of official foreign exchange reserves.
And then in the corporate sector, well, here's Dr. Carla Norloff. She is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, which is another think tank whose members are invited to advise Congress all the time and who are mainly pretty obviously devoted to preserving and expanding the World Trade System. Members of the Atlantic Council's board of directors include Henry Kissinger, Michael Hayden, General Dunford, General Wesley Clark, Michael Chertoff, Mark Esper, David Petraeus. You get the idea. Warmongers, basically. But Atlantic Council members know things about how the global game works, that's for sure. And so here's the Atlantic Council's Dr. Carla Norloff.
I will note that the dollar's dominance is not quite as strong amongst private actors in private markets as it is with governments. In private transactions, it averages about 45% of the world total. That includes FX transactions, but also things like issuance of international debt securities and cross-border banking.
So the dollar is clearly still dominant, but is demonstrably shrinking in both government transactions and private transactions. And here's an explanation of why they think we should care. So back to Dr. Tyler Goodspeed.
The fact that 90% of all foreign exchange transactions continue to involve the United States dollar and that global central banks continue to hold almost 60% of their foreign exchange reserves in U.S. dollars confers net economic benefits on the United States economy. First, foreign demand for reserves of U.S. dollars raises demand for dollar-denominated securities, in particular United States Treasuries. This effectively lowers the cost of borrowing for U.S. households, U.S. companies, and federal, state, and local governments. It also means that, on average, the United States earns more on its investments in foreign assets than we have to pay on foreign investments in the United States, which allows the United States to import more goods and services than we export. Second, foreign demand for large reserves of U.S. dollars and dollar-denominated assets raises the value of the dollar, and a stronger dollar benefits U.S. consumers and businesses that are net importers of goods and services from abroad. Third, large reserve holdings of U.S. currency abroad, in effect, constitutes an interest-free loan to the United States worth about $10 to $20 billion per year. Fourth, the denomination of the majority of international transactions in U.S. dollars likely modestly lowers the exchange rate risks faced by U.S. companies. Fifth, given the volume of foreign U.S. dollar holdings and dollar-denominated debt, monetary policy actions by foreign central banks generally have a smaller impact on financial conditions in the United States than actions by the United States Central Bank have on financial conditions in other countries.
So what stands out to me from his testimony is that dollar dominance allows us to pay lower interest rates, which is something that directly affects you if you have taken out any loans. It allows us to buy shit made overseas for cheaper than it would be if the dollar weren't dominant. It provides stability in exchange rates, which means predictable profits for multinational corporations. And the decisions of other countries' banks don't negatively affect us the way that the actions of our Federal Reserve can royally flip over other countries. You know, I'm recording this episode right now from Mexico City, and I saw coverage of the chairman of the Federal Reserve testifying to Congress all over the Spanish language news today, all over this hotel. You know, other countries have to care what happens in our government, but we don't really have to know shit about Mexico, do we? And for the most part, I think it's safe to say that most Americans don't. But dollar dominance isn't without its downsides. Here's Dr. Tyler Goodspeed.
However, the benefits of the U.S. dollar's global reserve status are not without costs. Though lower interest rates in the United States benefit U.S. borrowers, especially the federal government, they also lower returns to U.S. savers. In addition, though a stronger dollar benefits U.S. consumers and businesses that net import goods and services from abroad, it does also disadvantage U.S. firms that export goods and services abroad, as well as firms that compete against imported goods and services. Furthermore, the perception of the U.S. dollar as a safe haven asset means that demand for the dollar tends to increase in response to adverse macroeconomic events that are global in nature. As a result, the competitiveness of U.S. exporters and U.S. firms that compete against imported goods and services are likely to face an increased competitive disadvantage at times of elevated global macroeconomic stress.
These factors, these costs to dollar dominance, are discussed so infrequently, but I think they need to be highlighted. Because low interest rates, which dollar dominance affords us, benefits those who choose to go into debt and disadvantages the people who spend only what they can afford and save the rest. And I do feel personally harmed by this because I'm frugal to the point that maybe some people would call me cheap. I don't know, but I do know that I have no debt, which is how I can afford to do this for a living. And I do pack away what resources I get like a little squirrel who feels a chill in the air. And low interest rates since 2008 have meant that I have made very little on my savings. Low interest rates have basically forced me to put my savings in the stock market, which is the only place I've been able to get any kind of return. And this is why the stock market and the business press always gets excited in response to interest rate cuts, because low interest rates push risk-hating savers like me into the Wall Street casino. But this is also why interest rate hikes, like the ones that have been happening this year, are treated like catastrophes by the corporate press. Because higher interest rates allow savers to make money outside of the casino, and companies and people who are in debt have to pay back more when they go into debt. And so this dynamic that he describes, it makes perfect sense to me. I've experienced it in my own life, but I'd never considered it in relation to the dollar's dominance in the world before. Because dollar dominance does keep our interest rates lower than they would be if our currency were just, a currency like any other and not the global reserve currency. And therefore, it does hurt businesses that are based in the United States. And this is kind of an epiphany moment for me because this testimony is essentially saying that multinationals that want to sell to us, so the multinationals that make things in countries where they can pay people as little as possible, they are the ones benefited by dollar dominance. But the companies that stay here, the ones that employ Americans on American soil, truly American companies, they get hurt by dollar dominance if they are trying to make their products in the US and sell them around the world. It makes truly American companies disadvantaged in that competition. This is the first time, I guess, that I've questioned whether or not dollar dominance is 100% good. I've never really thought about it before because I have US dollars in my pocket and in my bank account, so why wouldn't I want those things to be dominant? But something does feel pretty dirty about preserving a circumstance that advantages the multinational corporations that maybe call themselves American, but who f***ed off at the first chance they got when the creation of the World Trade Organization and all those trade agreements eliminated so many taxes and eliminated the penalties for labor shopping, which allowed and encouraged them to manufacture their products in countries where they could avoid paying Americans good wages and instead pay foreign workers next to nothing and then pocket the difference. It also feels dirty to preserve a circumstance that tips the scales in favor of multinational companies with no connection to America at all, foreign companies. It just doesn't seem good to preserve a circumstance that makes it harder for truly American companies to compete with the ones that have no loyalty to us at all. And this system, the more I study it time and time again, the things that our current leaders in both corporate parties are so devoted to time and time again, the more I learn, I find examples in which their policies benefit the multinational corporations who abandon American workers or were never here to begin with to the detriment of actual U.S. companies and those of us who were employed by them here at home. And this is a factor in this dollar dominance discussion that I think needs to be considered more often. And to be clear, I'm not advocating for anything by saying this. I've made no conclusions about this. I'm just kind of like blown away by the thought of it. But, I'm in learning mode here, is what I'm saying. But I am, for the first time in my life, questioning whether the diminishing dollar dominance is something to totally panic about. Because reversing these costs to dollar dominance, that could be good. But as for the empowered people here in the United States, their perspectives are just so different from those of us worker bees. Most of those that we've put in power are in the shareholder class. They make most of their money from their investments in the stock market. They make money via getting cuts of the profits of the multinational corporations. And so when a multinational corporation abandons American workers and successfully labor shops and pockets the difference, so many members of Congress are those pockets. This Congress is full of millionaires who don't depend on their paychecks and make their money in dividends. There's some websites, Unusual Whales, QuiverQuant. I love these websites because they track stock market bets made by members of Congress, and their trades are massive. So just this week on June 22nd, according to QuiverQuant, Nancy Pelosi purchased between $250,000 and $500,000 worth of Apple stock and between $500,000 and $1 million worth of Microsoft. And I can't be more specific on that because the laws they have written for themselves don't require them to be more specific. But even on the lowest end of the range that she has to report, she used more than 3 times her annual congressional salary to place bets on 2 multinational corporations in hopes of getting a piece of their profits. Nancy Pelosi is not living off of her congressional paycheck. She is in the investor business. And that is true for the majority in Congress in both parties. And so it does make sense that they would view dollar dominance from the shareholder perspective instead of the American worker perspective, because that's who they are. But also, when dollar dominance is viewed from their perspective, there's one more factor in the cost-benefit analysis of dollar dominance that doesn't affect our day-to-day lives too much, certainly not as much as returns on our bank accounts or trade disadvantages for our truly American businesses. But there is one more factor which takes the cost-benefit analysis decisively out of the range of maybe being a tie into definite good for those who are empowered in the United States. Here's Dr. Tyler Goodspeed.
However, despite these costs, studies generally find that the economic benefits of the dollar's prominent global status outweigh the costs, providing a modest net benefit to the United States economy. This does not include the substantial benefit to which the chairman referred of the United States dollar's centrality in global transactions, allowing the United States to utilize financial sanction tools when appropriate in support of national security objectives.
Sanctions. Dollar dominance is why those empowered in the United States have the ability to wage economic wars. And Daniel McDowell expanded on that idea. Daniel McDowell is an associate professor of political science at Syracuse University and the author of Bucking the Buck, U.S. Financial Sanctions and the International Backlash Against the Dollar. And here's his testimony to Congress.
With little more than the stroke of the president's pen or through an act of Congress, the U.S. government can use financial sanctions to impose enormous economic costs on targeted foreign actors, be they individuals, firms, or state institutions, by freezing their dollar assets or cutting them off from access to the banks through which those dollars flow. The consequences for individual targets, known as specially designated nationals or SDNs, are severe, significantly impairing a target's capacity to participate in international trade, investment, debt repayment, and depriving them of access to their wealth. Over the last 2 decades, the United States has used the tool of financial sanctions with increasing frequency. For example, in the year 2000, just 4 foreign governments were directly targeted under a U.S. Treasury country program overseen by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. Today, that number is greater than 20, and if we include penalties from secondary sanctions, the list gets even longer. The more that the United States has reached for financial sanctions, the more it has made adversaries in foreign capitals aware of the strategic vulnerability that stems from dependence on the dollar. Some governments have responded by implementing anti-dollar policies, measures that are designed to reduce an economy's reliance on the U.S. currency for investment in cross-border transactions. Though these measures sometimes fail to achieve their goals, others have produced modest levels of de-dollarization. Notable examples here include Russian steps to cut its dollar reserves and reduce the use of the dollar in trade settlement in the years leading up to its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, or China's ongoing efforts to build its own international payments network based on the yuan, efforts that have taken on a new sense of urgency as Beijing has become more aware of its own strategic vulnerabilities from dollar dependence.
So the abuse of sanctions powers is leading other countries to try to limit their exposure to the dollar and therefore U.S. power. And instead of pulling back, United States elites are openly discussing escalating the abuse of sanctions power to an unprecedented extent. Because I just read a piece in Foreign Affairs, which is the paywalled magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations. And the article was co-written just last week by Lawrence Summers, who was President Clinton's Treasury Secretary and President Obama's Director of the National Economic Council. And then he became the chief economist at the World Bank. And this guy openly makes a detailed case for stealing all of Russia's money that is inside of multinational banks. And then he goes on to explain exactly how to do it. And so the world has seen and is continuing to see U.S. leaders use control over the financial system to punish other countries for political reasons. And they are openly discussing doing this to an extent that we've never seen before. And so China has been taking big steps to not only untangle itself from the U.S.-controlled financial web, but is also now in the process of creating a separate global-scale financial web, as we've discussed on this show many times. So, as we've already discussed, the BRICS system is a separate global financial system being created by China and others, but it's being led by China. And the BRICS countries have also opened their own development bank, in which, unlike all of the others, the U.S. is not only not the majority shareholder, but hasn't been welcome to join at all. The BRICS Development Bank has, since its founding in 2015, said openly and repeatedly that one of its main goals is de-dollarization, to issue loans to member countries in exchanges of local currencies instead of using the U.S. dollar. Now, members of this development bank include, the OG BRICS countries, the ones that the BRICS acronym stands for. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But they've also been joined in this bank by Bangladesh, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Uruguay, Argentina, Zimbabwe, and Saudi Arabia are in the process of joining. And not only are some of those countries big-time players economically in this world, but some of those countries should raise eyebrows because that is not a list of pinko commie enemies of the world trade system. So like India, for example, is a country that we militarily arm and perform massive military exercises with. India is also a member of the Quad, which is a military alliance that the Defense Department seems to have a lot of faith in, which is an alliance between our country, India, Australia, and Japan. And in fact, as I record this, India's president is hanging out with Joe Biden in the White House. And even though as recently as 2020, India got into a bit of a baby war with China along one of their borders, India is also a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is more of a military organization than an economic one. But that is a military organization, which is Shanghai. That's China. So they're playing both sides. And then back to the BRICS list, we also have Saudi Arabia. And we've been partners with Saudi Arabia in a weapons for oil-based relationship that goes back decades. We've also been partners in war with the United Arab Emirates, although Congress has finally started blocking weapons sales to those two countries because of their 9-year-long relentless destruction of Yemen. But the point I'm trying to make is that these countries have been military allies of ours for years. And it appears that important allies appear to be hedging their bets with double participation in the world trade system and whatever it is that China is creating. And I do want to let you know that there's one ally that has popped up on my radar a few times in this research that isn't in the same category as like Saudi Arabia, like an ally in oil, but did 9/11, so ally-ish. No, there's a country that is as ally as it gets. And while it's not an official member of any part of BRICS or any other China-led organization that I know of, France's president, Emmanuel Macron, is now openly encouraging Europe to reduce its dependence on what he called the extraterritoriality of the US dollar. Boom. Didn't think I'd get that word out. And his reason for thinking this is because, as he put it to political reporters in the EU, quote, if the tensions between the two superpowers heat up, referring to the US and China, we won't have the time nor the resources to finance our strategic autonomy, and we will become vassals, unquote, as in subservient to the Americans. And these feelings, at least in part, are stemming out of Ukraine. Because European countries have complained about the weaponization of the dollar by our leaders in Washington, D.C., because sanctions related to Ukraine are forcing European companies to give up business and cut ties with other countries, or they become targets of secondary sanctions as well. And their concerns are understandable. In the World Trade System, the whole point is that the world is supposed to come together within the World Trade Organization and the United Nations and make decisions together about how to punish countries when they go rogue. But with the United States having majority control over the World Trade System institutions and veto powers in both the World Trade System institutions and the United Nations, the United States has never been held accountable for our own warmongering or financial fuckery, and our leaders have been calling the shots on the Ukraine sanctions. And outside of indie media, we never hear about this in the United States. But there is open resentment of the United States in parts of Europe, with France's president now openly advocating for a distancing of Europe from the control of Washington, D.C. And whether you like it or you agree with it or not, many other countries in the rest of the world think our leaders are abusing their power. They are losing trust in our leaders, and they want to reduce the power of the Americans that we have elected. And the thing is, I think that these are feelings that many of us Americans can relate to. I know I can. But what to do about this is in the hands of the American people. American citizens not only have the privilege and responsibility at this moment to pick our own leaders, but we have the privilege and responsibility to pick the stewards of the global financial system. And the America that I think we could be if our country lived up to our stated ideals would, without a doubt, be an amazing leader for the world. One dedicated to equality, liberty, and justice for all, including perhaps justice for reckless bankers. But that's not who our leaders are right now, or have been during my lifetime, because it's the same group of people who have been empowered my entire lifetime. A senator who was elected to serve as a leader a decade before my birth is now the 81-year-old president of the United States. There's been no changing of the guard here in the United States, and the job performance of this group has been abysmal the entire time. You know it. And if we don't change our leadership, and by that I mean if we don't remove from power the elderly leaders of both corporate parties who have been steadily diminishing our standing in the world for the last 40 years, and if we don't do it quick, I mean, why would the rest of the world trust our leaders to rule the world if we don't trust them to run our country? And one of the things that has led to an international degradation of trust in the United States leaders has been sanctions abuse, as in using weapons of economic war without any consultation with or approval from the global institutions that supposedly govern the world. And abuse of sanctions is something I've personally documented as supported overwhelmingly by leaders and the grunts in both of our corporate parties. And so here's Dr. Daniel McDowell, the author of the book about international backlash against the dollar, advising Congress about what should be done about this.
The United States should reconsider the use of so-called symbolic financial sanctions. That is, if the main objective of a tranche of sanctions is to signal to the world or to a domestic audience that Washington disapproves of a foreign government's policy choices, other measures that can send a similar signal but do not politicize the dollar system ought to be considered first. Second, the use of financial sanctions against issuers of potential rival currencies, in particular China and Yuan, should face a higher bar of scrutiny. Even a small targeted sanctions program provides information to our adversaries about their vulnerabilities and gives them time to prepare for a future event when a broad U.S. sanctions program may be called upon as part of a major security crisis, when such measures will be most needed. Finally, whenever possible, U.S. financial sanctions should be coordinated with our allies in Europe and Asia, who should feel as if they are key stakeholders in the dollar system and not vassals to it. Such coordinated efforts will prevent our friends from seeking to conduct business with U.S. adversaries outside of the dollar system and send a message to the whole world that moving activities into secondary currencies like the euro or the yen is not a safe haven.
And the importance of coordination with allies on sanctions was emphasized by multiple witnesses. So here's Dr. Carla Norloff of the Atlantic Council.
To rein in external threats, the United States should, whenever possible, implement multilateral sanctions in support of broadly endorsed goals to shore up the liberal international order. This is likely to limit dollar backlash.
And when it comes to China, specifically in sanctions, Congress was also told that sanctions should be used with caution because pressuring China with sanctions probably won't even work. So here's Marshall Billingsley, who was a senior staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee during the Clinton years, when the World Trade Organization became a thing. He then served at the Deputy Assistant Secretary level at the Department of Defense during the Invade Iraq years of the George W. Bush administration. He then spent 4 years working for NATO and then came back to the States as George W. Bush's Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy. Then he went to the private sector to Deloitte to help multinational corporations make money around the world. And then he became President Trump's Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing at the Treasury Department. Now he's working at the Hudson Institute think tank. And in this testimony, he's going to mention SWIFT, which is the World Trade System's payment processing system. So like when I go to the supermercado across the street here in Mexico City and I use my Visa for my current snack obsession, Honey Nut Cheerios, Visa is using the SWIFT system to process my payment. And so here's his testimony about why, even now, sanctions against China specifically might not work.
The sheer size of the Chinese economy dwarfs what we've been contending with in the form of Iran, Russia, and so on. One of the first things the Biden administration did in the wake of Russia's attack was start sanctioning Russian banks and de-SWIFTing them. And that's one thing when you're going after an economy smaller than the size of Texas. It's quite another when you consider that out of the 100 largest banks in the world, China has 20, and all 4 of the top 4 are Chinese banks. And that is why many within the Treasury contended when I was there, and they will contend to this day, that these Chinese banks are simply too big to sanction. I don't agree that we can allow that to stand, but I do believe we have to start taking very swift action to put us in a situation where we could take punitive measures on these banks if necessary.
You know, it's hard to take punitive measures on Chinese banks we have no control over. But if they have to trade in the reserve currency, the U.S. dollar.
China considers the actual composition of its foreign exchange reserves to be a state secret. So they don't publish, and they view it as a criminal offense to try to obtain that information in terms of the balance of how much is gold, how much are dollar or euro denominated. But the numbers I've seen suggest that still at this moment, they're about 50 to 60% of their Forex reserves are still in dollars or euros, which means that they are at high risk of sanctions. We can affect them. The problem is that war chest that they've built up is enormous. It's more than $3 trillion that they have in Forex reserves. Compare that with what Russia had at the onset of its assault, which was around $680 billion, of which we managed to freeze overseas half of it. But Russia is still keeping its economy going despite the Biden administration's sanctions. So imagine how they're going to be able to continue with that sizable war kitty in Beijing if they do decide to go after the Taiwanese.
And so you can understand why China would want to limit its dependence on the dollar. Because our Congress is being told in videos that anyone on Earth can access that China's use of dollars and euros is a vulnerability that we can exploit. And so they're organizing with some other countries to create a system that does not rely on the dollar for international trades.
I'll say at the outset that I agree with you and others that, to paraphrase Mark Twain, reports of the dollar's demise have been greatly exaggerated. That said, we need to remind ourselves that in the 16th century, the Spanish silver dollar was the dominant currency. In the 17th century, it was Dutch florins. In the 18th century, it was the pound sterling. The link between a nation's currency and its role as the relatively dominant political actor on the world stage is pretty clear. And that is why people like Lula from Brazil, Putin, and Xi all aspire to undercut the role of the dollar as the global reserve currency.
And here are signs of progress by de-dollarizing countries that Congress is being told to watch out for.
If we look at what Russia did in the run-up to its further invasion of Ukraine, they began dumping ownership of treasury bonds in 2018. In that year, they plummeted from $96 billion in holdings down to $15 billion, and they also started buying large amounts of gold. China is now, as the ranking member has observed, embarking on its own gold buying spree. I haven't seen the data for May, but April marked the 6th straight month of Chinese expansion in its gold holdings. And I'm not sure I believe the official figures. We have to recall that China is the dominant gold mining player around the world, and half of those gold mining companies are state-owned. So the actual size of China's war chest when it comes to gold reserves may be far higher. In fact, I suspect inevitably far higher than official numbers suggest. Last year, China also started dumping its treasuries. 2022 marked the largest or second largest decrease on record, with a drop of about 174 billion, and China stood at the lowest level since 2010 in terms of its holdings, though this past March they did reverse course. This bears close watching because a sell-off may be a strong indicator of planned aggression.
And this guy also went a little further into why these gold purchases and gold holdings matter.
The thing I do worry, and I come back to this fact that they've been buying a lot of gold, is that one of the things that they could do, which would be very concerning if they wind up having larger reserves of gold than we believe, is they could start issuing yuan or gold-denominated, gold-backed yuan contracts. And that would further their ambition for introducing the yuan onto the world stage.
And so what is Congress being told is going to happen next? Here's Dr. Tyler Goodspeed again, the guy who advised Trump on economics for 4 years and who is now advising multinational corporations. And by the way, the yuan and the renminbi are the same thing. Two names for China's currency.
Short term, I think the risk is that we continue to see diversification away from the dollar, PRC continuing to push other countries to use trade invoicing in renminbi, that they continue to promote the offshore renminbi market, that they continue to promote or force bilateral clearing. Longer term, I think the bigger risk is that foreign investors no longer perceive the United States federal government debt to be as safe and risk-free as it is today perceived.
So perhaps if you land on the side of thinking that the dollar as the reserve currency is good for the United States, perhaps you should think twice about voting for anyone in the Republican Party, seeing as they have established a pattern of threatening not to pay the United States' debts whenever they want something politically from an administration controlled by the other party. The debt ceiling games, should they continue, will eventually have global scale consequences. Now, we don't seem to be there yet, but other countries are clearly creating the infrastructure needed to be ready when countries and governments want an alternative to the US dollar and the global financial system that we control and abuse. So here's Dr. Daniel McDowell, the author of the book about international backlash against the dollar.
And the demonstration of U.S. control over the actual flow of dollars, of communication, absolutely provides information to adversaries to prepare for events where they may face similar circumstances. And so I think what we're seeing is, China, we're seeing Russia, we're seeing other countries try to create alternative, certainly payments networks. Russia has its own SPFS payment messaging system. It's quite small. It was launched in 2014, not coincidentally, after the initial round of sanctions targeting Russia. In terms of SIPS, China's cross-border payments network, Belarus announced it was having banks join immediately following the 2022 sanctions. And so what I'm saying is there's a pattern, right, between when the United States mobilizes control over the pipes and the messaging of cross-border payments and adversaries looking for alternatives. Doesn't mean they're using them, but they're getting plugged into the system as at least sort of a rainy day option in the event of a future targeting.
And even though, as he described, there's more than one alternative payment system being created, there's really only one country whose system Congress is being told to be concerned about.
I look at China not just as a typical country, because I think they're an alternative service provider. All right, most countries fall into alternative service users. They're looking for an alternative to the dollar. China, you could perhaps put Europe in this as well. The only two sort of economic blocks capable, I think, of constructing an attractive enough cross-border payments network that could attract those alternative service users that are looking for that network. Right. And so that's why I think, again, with China, there should be a higher bar of scrutiny.
But as of right now, here's Dr. Carla Norloff of the Atlantic Council.
The Chinese yuan poses no immediate threat to dollar dominance. It accounts for roughly 3% of overall reserves. And so far, China has been successful in promoting the yuan with its trade partners, but the yuan is scarcely used by countries outside trade with China. China is a potential long-term challenger due to its active pursuit of trade and investment relationships. If the yuan is increasingly used by third countries, it will pose a greater threat to the dollar.
But remember this testimony from the president on the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, in 2008?
And the bottom line is China is not yet a military competitor, much less a military peer. Interestingly, I think Chinese leaders understand this. And they understand just how much their country requires decades of external stability so that they can continue to focus their energies and their attention on economic growth and political evolution. China is an emerging country, but in no way is it a revolutionary threat to world order as we know it.
That was only 15 years ago, and now China is the red boogeyman haunting the dreams of Republicans and Democrats alike. But why isn't the yuan/renminbi a greater threat at this moment? Well, here's Jesse Schrager. He is another member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's a current associate professor at Columbia Business School.
So fundamentally right now, the renminbi it's not yet positioned to compete with the US dollar for a number of reasons. First and foremost, the reason that the dollar plays the role it does in the international financial system is it provides the global safe asset. You're confident, except for the upcoming debt ceiling, that you will always be paid back if you own US dollars. That's fundamentally what you know. When you contemplate investing in China and holding Chinese renminbi as reserves, you're not necessarily sure that you're going to be able to turn that piece of paper into the goods and services that you need or intervening in FX markets.
And here are the circumstances during which Congress is being told that China's currency will become a real threat.
I think the real way in which people start being able to issue and borrow in renminbi is when people start thinking in terms of the goods that they need to buy and consume are in renminbi. Fundamentally, if you issue, most countries around the world, if they issue a bond in renminbi, the calculation they have to do is then, okay, I'm going to take my renminbi and convert it into US dollars to buy the thing in which I need. And so while actions in the US financial system are certainly going to affect other countries' decisions to borrow in renminbi, the kind of underlying challenges in Chinese financial markets and fundamentally the lack of goods priced and sold in renminbi are going to continue to hold back kind of a growth of this market for a while. And in particular, the fact that many countries are reluctant to try to raise money inside of China's liquid onshore capital markets for effectively fear of capital controls. If you've raised renminbi in China, you can't get that out into your projects the way you can if you raise money in the US in dollars.
And so what is China doing to overcome these obstacles?
First and foremost, what China is trying to do is essentially convince countries around the world that the renminbi is an alternative asset to invoice your trade and to invest in. And so on the investment side, they've been working very hard to actually allow in foreign capital, so encouraging foreign central banks to hold renminbi-denominated bonds as their reserves. And on the trade side, they're encouraging firms to invoice, basically price their goods in renminbi. There's a few areas in which they've had challenges there. So first, we actually don't know who are holding most of these renminbi-denominated assets. What you can see is after the U.S. sanctioned Russia back in 2014, it was the Russian central bank that effectively announced they were moving out of U.S. dollar-denominated assets and into renminbi. So they did that publicly. And so, China has effectively been trying to attract foreign capital of that form. And a lot of the reasons for that is that China finds itself vulnerable in the dollar-based financial system. And so what I would say the fundamental area in which the United States can assure the dominance of the dollar is making everyone understand that U.S. Treasuries are the world safe asset, that there is no state of the world in which the United States can or will default.
See how often the debt ceiling games were alluded to? Congress was warned over and over again in these hearings that every time Republicans use the debt ceiling as a bargaining chip, they are helping China in their quest to convince the world that the U.S. currency is not a safe bet. Here's another example. Here's Dr. Carla Norloff of the Atlantic Council.
And in addition to these external threats, there is also a domestic threat. Flirting with the possibility of a voluntary default puts dollar dominance at risk. What should the U.S. do to maintain dominance? To curb the domestic threat, Congress should consider creating an alternative mechanism for resolving political differences on government spending and its consequences.
Republicans are the domestic threat. The Republicans are the ones telling the world that payments of our debts are not guaranteed. These are entirely self-inflicted wounds. And so for anyone worried about the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, the Republican Party should not be a viable option for your vote come next November. It really is that simple. But during that whole unnecessary debt ceiling crisis that we just went through, the Republicans were correct about one thing. The debt itself is a problem. Now, as I explained in furious detail in the last episode, the Republicans were just saying words about the debt as their actions clearly demonstrate that they don't give a hot shit about the debt. Anyone who argues for always increasing war budgets, refuses to crack down on price gouging of our government by private companies, and refuses to consider increasing taxes is not serious about the debt. And that describes the actual policies enacted in legislation by the Republican Party. But when it comes to the debt, here's Dr. Tyler Goodspeed, the Trump advisor turned multinational advisor.
As deficits mount and as the debt burden rises above 100%, I think the Congressional Budget Office has it ending the budget window at about 119% of our economy, then we will probably observe an acceleration of diversification away from the dollar as a hedge. I don't see another single currency displacing the dollar as the major international currency or as the major reserve currency, but continued diversification.
Unsustainable debt is a problem because one of the ways to deal with the debt, which our country has already proven to the world that it's willing to do, is to create more and more dollars, which devalues them. More dollars in circulation means each dollar is worth less. That's why it costs $8 now for a Big Mac. The Big Mac didn't get any better. Our money got worse. And so none of this inspires faith in the dollar. And so that's where we stand. And as for what we should make of all this, I don't know. I have no idea. But I found that all really interesting, and I feel like I got some more pieces of information in my head that hopefully will help me understand the word a little bit better. But there is one word that keeps running through my head as I watch these things and as I put these episodes together, and that word is coexistence. Because the only thing that seems clear to me is that other countries don't trust us and are building an alternate global financial system, an alternate to the system that we created and largely control. And we are going to be best served by finding a way for more than one system to exist. So when I look at the big picture, the World Trade Organization, most countries, including China and Russia, they're in it. And so what I kind of am leaning towards, if I'm advocating for anything, is that the World Trade Organization and the institutions that make up the overall system, they can be changed to facilitate coexistence. They can be used to play the role of mediator between the countries, which is what the world was at least told that they were designed to do. But just because the World Trade System has been a tool of U.S. power and privatization for multinational corporations, the system doesn't have to stay that way. Again, this is why I don't bother discussing all of this stuff in the abstract with terms like capitalism or neoliberalism or framing the opposite of those things as socialism or communism. I just don't think the isms are helpful because these institutions are real things with nameable humans making decisions about what the rules are and how they will be enforced. These are rules that are written on signed agreements. These are rules that can be understood, and these are rules that can be changed. And while I'm not going to pretend that I fully understand all of this or know how to change them at this point, I do know, at the very least, that they should be named and examined far more often than they are. Because as you heard, the elites controlling the world talk about them all the time. They talk about the power these institutions have and how that power is divided and how that power is used and abused. And so I hope this episode helped you to understand what's happening at least a little bit better so that you can join the conversation that they are having, to move away from the isms and to more clearly understand and discuss the economic doctrines in these institutions, new ones and old, that are actually governing the world. Okay, producers, you win. You may have noticed that at the beginning of the episode, I did not do the value for value pitch, and that is because you stepped up and paid me not to. So we just barely made it, but we did make the $500 Venmo goal since the last episode. And so you made this episode better. Thank you very much for doing that. If you're new to this podcast and you don't know what I'm talking about, here's the value for value pitch. So this podcast, you've noticed I had no ads in it. That's on purpose. People want to pay me all the time to tell you about their companies or their political candidates or whatever. I'm constantly deleting emails, but I do not allow this on this show because, as you may have noticed, I think that corporations have a lot of power in this world and they're not going to have any power over me in what I say. So instead, I rely on the listeners to fund this project. Essentially, what I do is I give you my product up front. I think it has intrinsic value because there's a lot of research that goes into this. And you return that value in whatever financial form works for you in whatever amount feels fair. All of the options are listed on the support page on congressionaldish.com, and there's quite a few of them. There's people who like to send in old school paper checks to the Congressional Dish mailbox, which then gets forwarded to my sister, who is my accountant. So even though I'm in Mexico City, your checks are safely going to the same person and are getting deposited twice a month. I also accept Patreon. That is the easiest way to get access to my green room, which is where we have bonus content. And every once in a while, we do Ask Me Anythings, which are really fun. So that's up there right now. And then, like I said before, for this episode, there are some extra clips here that I found interesting, but not essential. And so I'm going to share those in the green room. You can also get access to the green room if you pay regularly via paper checks or PayPal or any method that works for you on a regular basis, but you'll have to email Lauren at congressionaldish.com and she will give you our jerry-rigged way of getting you that feed when she gets around to it. Like I said, the easiest way is to just support the show on Patreon. But yeah, when you support the show, there's sometimes bonus stuff, but really the reason to support the show is because there's nothing else like this. You know, how many other podcasts are giving you all their sources? And so that's how we fund this podcast. Thank you to everyone who participates. And thank you to everyone who sent in Venmos and made it so that I didn't have to do this pitch at the top. And so let's make this a regular thing. Every time in between an episode, we hit the 500 mark on Venmo, which is what we used to be hitting regularly when I did thank you episodes. Every time we hit that, I will not put an ad up at top and I will keep it at the end. So if you want to make a difference on the actual production of the podcast in that way, you know what to do, and you send in the Venmo payments. But I also want to thank our executive producers. We actually did have an executive producer for the last episode, but I did not check my email as closely as I should have. But Stephen McMahon, you have been such a wonderful part of this podcast for so long. And so I'm very happy to have your name on Congressional Dish 270, the Twitter Files episode. If you're not aware, executive producers are people that pay a cumulative $535. Every time you hit that amount, you get to put your name on an episode, which lends your vouch to that episode and moves it up the list on the most valuable episodes list on congressionaldish.com. And that's really great for new users because I get questions all the time about what episodes should I listen to. Well, instead of taking it from me, you can take it from the people that actually find so much value in these episodes that they're willing to literally pay for them. And so Twitter Files is moving up the list. I'm also very pleased that we have 2 executive producer requests for the last episode, for the debt ceiling episode. It's already got 2. So thank you to Douglas Manley, who did not send in a message, but he is now an executive producer on the debt ceiling episode. And so is Mark, I'm sorry if I don't pronounce this correctly, but so is Mark Shade. And Mark sent in a message. So he said, "Good morning, Jen and Congressional Dish team. Apologies in advance if this is the incorrect method to look for executive producer credit. I didn't see anything else within the green room. I'd like to go ahead and seek an executive producer credit for the latest 275, which is the episode's number, please. By the way, to claim your executive producer credit, you can do it however you want. I've had people reach out to me on Twitter, Instagram, email, Patreon. Just get a hold of us because what we do is we just check the numbers. Lauren has been doing very detailed accounting since I think like 2016 or 2017. I don't know. But we'll just make sure that you hit 535 and you're good to go. So there is no such thing as an incorrect method for claiming your credit. Back to his note, he said, I continue to be disgusted by the disgraceful conduct of our nation's congressional representatives that they carry out in our name. In addition to state-by-state gerrymandering efforts to secure incumbents and majorities, the parties are working overtime to limit our control should we wake up to what is going on. Yep. I continue to believe in Jen and the team's work on Congressional Dish. Congressional Dish 275 is an emblematic example of this work, the hostage-taking political games, as if any of this is a silly game. The full faith and credit of the United States is nothing to play games over. I hope that more listeners will come to listen to this great piece of work. Facts get played with like games nowadays too, but I believe in seeking knowledge and using that knowledge to fire representatives that play disgusting games like these in Congress. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes, and get fired. Thank you, and sincerely, Mark. Well, thank you for supporting the show, Mark. I obviously agree with every single word you said. I think that knowledge is power. And in that regard, I would like to spread this knowledge too. And I still just don't know how to do it. So if you don't mind sharing these episodes along with supporting them financially, that would be really helpful because, you know, Claire's doing a great job with social media. She's making it a lot easier for you guys to share some of this content. So please follow Congressional Dish on Instagram. We have a TikTok and we have Congressional Dish's Twitter, but she's doing a really killer job on Instagram. And that way you can grab the posts that she is making and share them on your own social media feeds. But if you can just share these episodes, because that's how this podcast is going to grow. Ever since my episodes about Ukraine and doing the Twitter Files episode, I'm more and more convinced that I'm shadow banned. So nothing I do really grows all that organically. Although at this point, my personal social media feeds, I don't use them that much and I'm a much happier person. So yeah, Claire's doing our social media, but really the way this podcast is going to grow is by you telling your friends that and family members or whoever you think will benefit from this, sharing with them specific episodes, badgering them until they actually listen to it. Because I find that most people don't want to try this podcast because it sounds boring because it's about Congress and it is quite wonky. But once people start listening, they get hooked. But you're going to have to badger people into trying an episode. So pick your favorite episode. Check out the most valuable episodes list for the ones that the executive producers obviously find to be the most valuable. Try and get someone to press play. And I think if we all did that at this point, the show could grow much faster than it has. But I'm glad at least some of us has this information, right? So, yeah. As for the next episode, I don't know yet. There's some weird things that went down in Congress this week, so I'm going to look into it. There was actually a lot of good hearings, too, but I will be back with another episode. I'm taking off the week of 4th of July, because if any podcaster gets to take off Independence Day, I think it should be this independent podcaster, don't you think? So I'm taking 1 week off, but there's 5 Sundays in July, so I will still have 2 episodes for you in July until you hear my voice again. Or if you want to hear me sooner than that, go on Patreon, because I have more bonus content for you. But if you are not paying for the podcast, I hope you have a safe and happy 4th of July. Please be careful. Don't explode your face or anything with firecrackers. It's not worth it. I will be celebrating American Independence Day in Mexico, but we are a melting pot, so even that works, you know? But yeah, be safe, be happy, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for listening.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. With the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we we can't deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.